It started with a cough. Not the sharp rattle common to hive workers or the dry scrape caused by recycled air, but something damp and persistent, like a seed taking root in my throat. In the hive, coughing is as ordinary as hunger. The air is thick with metal dust, the water tastes faintly of corrosion, and every corridor is packed with bodies harboring their own plagues. A cough is nothing, but this one refused to leave. At the time, I served as a medic orderly in the lower tiers of Tertius Magna, level 700, where desperation flavored the air just as strongly as rust. Our clinic tended to the endless ranks of laborers whose lives were chewed up by the Imperium's immense appetite. Rad burns, chemical exposure, quiet mutations swept under medical silence. These were our everyday ailments. I thought I knew pain. I didn't. The first patient arrived on a Tuesday. She couldn't have been more than 20. Pale, exhausted, and reeking faintly of protein vats from the night shift. She complained of a worsening cough. When she opened her mouth for examination, I noticed it. A faint green tinge to her gums. Saliva thicker than normal, glistening strangely under the lumen strips. Her breath carried a cloying sweetness that made me swallow back nausea. I gave her the standard antibiotic course, told her it would clear up. I believed it. 3 days later, she returned. Her cough had deepened, but it was her skin that troubled me. Small lesions, coin-sized, had begun appearing on her arms. Their edges pulsed, faint but rhythmic, as if responding to some inner heartbeat. The surrounding flesh had taken on a waxen quality, and when I pressed one lesion, a translucent fluid seeped out, smelling of rot mixed with something disturbingly pleasant. I sent her to the upper levels for proper care. She never arrived. The transport crew later found her lying in an alley, collapsed, but not dead. When they moved the body, her eyes snapped open and she smiled. They burned her remains and locked the report away. Officially forgotten. But I remembered. More importantly, I had been near her. I had breathed what she breathed. My cough began 3 days later. I tried treating myself with every tool at my disposal. The lab work was immaculate. Better than usual, in fact. Elevated immune markers, excellent cardiovascular readings. By every metric, I was thriving, except for the cough and the dreams. Sleep in the underhive is never restful, but now I was transported to impossible gardens stretching without end. Lush growths sprouting from corpses, fruits throbbing like organs, trees that wept infection. Their leaves murmured in languages my waking mind did not know, yet somehow understood. I wandered among these gardens freely. Spore-heavy air filled my lungs with relief I had never known, and something watched me. Vast, decaying, tender. I woke refreshed yet uneasy, the memory of warmth fading into cold reality. Then the symptoms began creeping forward. Greenish nails, slightly thickened skin near my joints, subtle alterations easily dismissed as stress. But my cough worsened, and with it came a secretion that was anything but human. Under a microscope, it resembled living blossoms, petaled cellular shapes pulsing softly. When cultured, the samples flourished with unnatural vigor, and they were beautiful, hypnotic, terrifying. Others began noticing changes in me. Dr. Matthias remarked on my improved bedside manner. Long, difficult patients calmed in my presence. Touching them seemed to ease their suffering, though not by healing it. Rather, they began accepting their pain, regarding it not as torment, but as revelation. My hands felt warm to them, alive. I knew the truth. I was becoming a conduit. The turning point came on a night shift during TERS. From the isolation ward came singing. That room was meant for the dying, those too contagious or broken for the general ward. Silence usually ruled there, but tonight, a rich contralto voice filled the corridor with something that felt more like worship than song. The sound came from bed 7. Jeremiah Court, a man whose body had been nearly dissolved by industrial acid. He should have been dead days ago. Instead, he sat upright, burns transforming into grotesque flora, miniature fungal forms and luminescent growths waving gently with each breath. When he turned toward me, his eyes, milky, crawling with movement beneath the cataracts, saw more than sight should allow. "You hear it too," he said. His voice harmonized with the growths on his skin. "The song, it was always there. We were simply too unwell to notice. I tried to deny it. I failed. I heard it, a deep, resonant melody pulsing through the hive walls, through the vents, through my very bones. Life feeding on death, death nurturing life, a cycle eternal and intimate. It started with a cough," I murmured. He smiled with serene certainty. "It always starts small. The grandfather never rushes. I knew the teachings. I knew the doctrine. Nurgle's touch was corruption, but standing in that living green glow, I felt doubt gnaw through everything I'd believed. My own changes sped up. The sputum I expelled became more plant than phlegm. My skin took on green undertones. Gold motes danced in my eyes when I caught my reflection, and the visions grew stronger. I no longer just visited the garden. I worked within it. I tended suffering souls, teaching them not to escape pain, but to understand it, to bloom through it. And back in the clinic, the same results appeared. Patients weren't cured, but they no longer feared their ailments. They slept better. They accepted themselves. This frightened Matthias. He noticed my unorthodox methods. Reports of similar cases elsewhere had reached the administratum. An inspection was inevitable. And it came 3 weeks later. They arrived dressed as health auditors, but their void black uniforms and silver aquila masks marked them as redemptionists, enforcers of purity, not medicine. They stalked through the clinic like butchers preparing livestock. I hid in a supply closet, watching as they interrogated Matthias in front of our patients. They accused him of unapproved results, unorthodox improvements, heretical teachings, and he defended us, weakly, fearfully. The patients looked bewildered. I had eased their suffering. How could that be a crime? But in the Imperium, anything unfamiliar is heresy. Transformation is treason. Hope is forbidden. They announced they would question the staff next, starting with an orderly who had drawn attention. Me, I could have run into the underhive tunnels and vanished, but that would leave the patients unprotected and abandon everything I was becoming. So I stepped from the supply closet and into the ward. "You're searching for me," I said. The lead interrogator turned. Even through the mask, I felt his satisfaction. The lead interrogator fixed his blank mask on me. "Orderly Valdrich Hess," he intoned. "You have been practicing medicine beyond your remit. Worse, you have been spreading teachings contrary to imperial truth. Do you deny these accusations?" I glanced around the ward. Mrs. Korvich, whose relentless pain had taught her patience instead of despair. Thomas Herrick, whose ruined lungs had become a sort of meditation. Sarah Chen, whose scarred skin had revealed a strange new beauty beneath its flaws. They all stared at me, hope and terror warring across their faces. "I deny nothing," I said. "I've helped people find peace. If that is heresy, then perhaps heresy is simply a kind of mercy." His hand drifted to the plasma pistol at his belt. "Heresy is never mercy," he replied coldly. "It is the first step to damnation." "Then allow me to show you what damnation truly looks like," I said, and opened my mouth. The sound that came out was no longer fully human. It was the song Jeremiah Court had sung, but changed, richer, deeper, layered with harmonics that spoke of rot and rebirth, of corpses feeding gardens, of life sprouting joyfully from decay. As I sang, the organisms blooming in my lungs released their spores. The change in the air was instantaneous. The sterile, over-filtered atmosphere of the clinic thickened, grew heavy with possibility. The metal walls began to show veins of creeping green, a living patina crawling across the surface like purposeful mold. The lumen strips flickered, dimming, but the bioluminescent glow swelling in my throat provided a warmer, gentler light, and the patients began to change. What followed did not resemble a massacre. There was no chorus of screams, no sudden, monstrous metamorphosis. It felt instead like dawn. Mrs. Corvish straightened in her bed, moving joints that had been nearly immobile for decades. The swelling in her fingers remained, but now tiny buds had emerged from her knuckles. They pulsed softly in time with the melody, adding a quiet, organic percussion to the song pouring from my throat. Thomas Herrick's ragged breaths turned musical. Every inhale and exhale became part of a living orchestra. The scarred labyrinth of his lungs, carved by years of toxic exposure, had reshaped itself into intricate chambers that gave his breath new tones and overtones. He was no longer fighting for air. He was playing his own body like an instrument. Sarah Chen's once rough patches of skin transformed completely. The scales along her face and arms unfolded into a tapestry of tiny petals, each opening and closing with her shifting emotions. When she smiled, her features blossomed like a sunrise garden. The Redemptionists raised their weapons, but their hands trembled. The spores were touching them as well, not compelling transformation, but offering it, suggesting gently that their rigid worship of purity was its own kind of death, that real life meant change. "Abomination," the chief interrogator rasped, but conviction no longer anchored his voice. Beneath the mask, I could sense his uncertainty, his fear, and something else, the first stirrings of curiosity. "Not abomination," I answered, my voice layered with the now familiar harmonics. Evolution, the next step. Humanity was never meant to remain frozen, unchanged in an ever-shifting universe. Dr. Matthias, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "So the reports were accurate," he murmured. "You've been altered, touched by something beyond this reality." "Infected," I said, tasting the word. "Perhaps. But infection implies an unwanted invader. I invited this. I opened myself to possibilities the Imperium tells us to fear. Chaos, corruption," one of the Redemptionists whispered. "He bears the mark of the ruinous powers." "Ruinous?" I laughed, and the sound rippled like wind through tall, overgrown grass. "Look around you. Do you see ruin, or people who are finally at peace with themselves?" They couldn't see it. To eyes trained from birth to worship one single, narrow ideal, any divergence from sanctioned human form had to be monstrous. The patients' newfound beauty was horror to them. The peace my patients had found in their altered bodies could only be interpreted as spiritual decay, and they weren't entirely wrong, from the Imperium's point of view. What had happened here was a corruption of the imperial model of humanity. But what is corruption if not transformation? When a worm becomes a butterfly, its old form is destroyed. When a seed splits, its shell is ruined. That ruination is called growth. The Redemptionists opened fire. Plasma bolts tore through the air where I had been standing a heartbeat before. But I was no longer confined to the clumsy limits of untreated flesh. The changes within me had opened new modes of movement. I slipped and drifted through the space between bolts, like smoke, like drifting spores. My patients were not so lucky. The shots burned across the ward, intended to purge and cleanse. Instead, they became catalysts. I learned then that death was not the opposite of what we had become. It was the next phase. Mrs. Corv absorbed a bolt that should have annihilated her. Her body burst outward into a riot of living tissue, vines, tubers, tendrils, and blossoms, rapidly arranging themselves into new forms. Her consciousness spread through the burgeoning mass like sap. She became a living garden, throbbing with alien thought and the same gentle kindness that had always defined her. Thomas Herrick's end was exquisite. The plasma that pierced his chest ignited the transformed structures of his lungs, and he exploded into a storm of glowing spore. Each breath of his dying body expelled seeds of new growth. His final exhalation filled the entire ward with shimmering dust, each mote a dormant possibility. Sarah Chen simply smiled as the plasma enveloped her. Her skin, already a living field of petals, burst open. She dissolved into a golden haze of pollen that the vents eagerly drew into the air systems. In death, she would ride every breath taken in the underhive, offering the same choice she had accepted: embrace change or fight it. The redemptionists could only stare. They had intended to obliterate the infection, but their weapons had only driven it into overdrive. The air now vibrated with life. Each inhale carried the blueprint of transformation. "What have you done?" the interrogator demanded. His voice stuttered strangely as his mask's vocoder struggled with the new frequencies creeping into his speech. "I've given them what they truly desired," I replied. "Freedom from the cage of static flesh, the chance to be more than the Imperium permits." Matthias edged toward the exit, face bloodless. He understood more quickly than the others. "This doesn't end here," he said quietly. "It will spread." "Like all living things," I agreed. "Growth can be delayed, never stopped. Life thrives most fiercely where conditions are harshest." The redemptionists tried to withdraw, but their movements grew sluggish, hesitant. The spores coiled around their thoughts, not compelling obedience, but offering alternatives. Their zealotry was being gnawed at by images of what they could become if they ceased to resist. One of them, a younger man whose youth showed despite the mask, stumbled, collapsing to his knees. He tore off his mask to gasp for air, and his changing features were naked before us. The harsh lines carved by indoctrination softened, replaced by something open, searching. "It feels—" he began, but language deserted him. "Peaceful," I suggested. "Like finally coming home?" He nodded, choking on tears. Not of pain, of relief. He was remembering what it meant to be fully alive instead of just obedient. The lead interrogator raised his pistol toward him, but his grip shook so badly the shot went wild, melting part of the ceiling. Where the metal sagged and dripped, new fibrous growths immediately began knitting through the molten edges, reclaiming them. "You're all lost," he whispered hoarsely. "Beyond redemption." "Maybe so," I said softly. "But if this is damnation, then your salvation must be a very cold, empty thing." He broke then, turned and ran, crashing through the clinic doors into the underhive corridors beyond. But it was already far too late. The air system had taken our spores up into its vast lungs. The hive itself was beginning to learn new ways to live. Matthias hovered at the threshold, torn between everything he had been and everything he might become. "There's no way back from this, is there?" he asked. I looked around the transformed ward. Walls overgrown with living patterns, air perfumed with the sweetness of change. The dead were not truly dead. They were woven into the newly forming ecosystem. Minds diffused through networks of flesh and metal. "Would you want to go back?" I asked gently. "Look at what we've done. Pain turned to music, suffering reshaped into beauty, death revealed as another way of living. Why choose the old gray misery instead?" He stood in silence, thinking, then unpinned his physician's badge and let it fall. The moment it touched the floor, tiny tendrils sprouted and began to draw it in. "Show me," he said. Matthias's transformation was a quiet, deliberate unfurling. Years of medical knowledge made him an ideal candidate for conscious evolution rather than chaotic change. I placed my hand over his heart and let the gift flow. His blood changed first, thickening into a richer medium designed to carry more than oxygen and nutrients, chemical messages, potentialities, and memory. His heart grew additional chambers, its beat shifting into layered rhythms that produced soft, musical reverberations through his ribs. Then his lungs. New structures branched from his bronchi, delicate, filigreed organs able to sift not only oxygen, but the complex organic vapors now saturating the atmosphere. Each breath became both respiration and perception. But it was his mind that transformed most profoundly. his neural tissue reconfigured, growing pathways to support expanded consciousness. His awareness stretched beyond his own body, touching the network of growing life around us. "I can see them," he whispered, his voice now echoing with the same strange harmonics as mine. "The patients. They're not gone. They're connected. Everywhere." He was right. Mrs. Corvish's gentle presence pulsed through the fleshy outgrowths spreading along the walls. Thomas's musical exhalations echoed softly through the ventilation shafts. Sarah's bright joy bloomed in the fresh flowers, nudging up through cracks in the floor. They were caretakers now, gardeners within the garden. "How far will it reach?" Matthias asked, though we both already knew. "As far as it's needed," I answered. "Grandfather Nurgle is in no hurry, but he never stops. This hive is just the seed pod. From here, the spores will drift to other levels, other districts, eventually other worlds." The process was already underway. The spores released during the firefight would spread through every duct, every corridor. In clinics across Tertius Magna, physicians and orderlies would soon start coughing. They'd dismiss it at first. They'd all had coughs before. Then the dreams would come. Endless gardens, patient rot. Healing that didn't mean going back, but becoming something new. Some would cling to the creed of purity. Others would listen. In time, resistance would weaken, not under force, but under comparison. Because what we offered was simply better. Who, when given the choice, clings to pain instead of peace? Who prefers isolation to connection? Who willingly embraces a sterile emptiness over a warm, living embrace? "We should go," Matthias said at last, nodding toward the growing roar of engines outside. "They'll be back, with more troops and worse weapons." He was right. The failed purge would trigger escalation. Flamers, virus bombs, bombardment, whatever it took. The Imperium had only one answer to anything it called chaos: annihilation. Still, I felt no urgency. The garden had already rooted itself. Whether I survived the next hour was irrelevant. The work would continue, without me, through me, despite me. But there were other places that needed seeds. We slipped into the maintenance ducts as heavy vehicles rumbled into position above. Behind us, the clinic continued its metamorphosis, walls swelling with life, air thickening with promise. The deep tunnels beneath Tertius Magna were older than the hive itself. Relics of past civilizations buried under strata of imperial architecture. In those forgotten spaces, we found others who had felt the same call. Workers ruined by toxins, dwellers of the lowest sumps already halfway adapted to poison, even a few former arbitrators whose faith in imperial justice had cracked. We gathered in what had once been a temple to some long-dead deity. The walls still showed murals of death and rebirth cycles. Images that resonated perfectly with the truth we had learned. Our origins varied, but we shared the same revelation. Suffering could teach. Change was not corruption, but growth. Life and death formed a single, unbroken loop. Petra, whose years in protein processing had wrecked her lungs, described her first vision. "I saw I wasn't broken," she said. "Just dormant, a seed waiting to sprout. The damage was the preparation, not the end." The others murmured in understanding. Klaus, his skin a patchwork of chemical scars, now traced the burns like sacred lines. Each ruined patch had become fertile ground for new growth, an atlas of future possibilities. We were not alone in the dark either. Others touched by different aspects of change had joined us, their mutations complementing our own. Together, we formed something layered and complex, like a diverse ecosystem. Matthias had become our de facto guide. Not a commander, Nurgle breeds gardeners, not dictators, but a shepherd of growth. "The Imperium will keep escalating," he warned us. "They can't permit this to spread. We must be ready." Above, we could hear the fortification work, barricades, quarantine seals, purging teams. Official notices would speak of a contained outbreak, something manageable. We knew better. What had taken root was not a pathogen, but an idea. And ideas are harder to burn than bodies. "Let them come," Petra said, her altered lungs turning her words into chords. "What can they threaten us with? Death? We've already passed through that gate. What we are now is beyond their weapons." And she was right, more right than she knew. The change we had undergone had rewritten what death meant to us. Our minds were no longer trapped inside single, fragile bodies. We were strands in a wider weave, part of a growing network of thought and flesh spreading through the hive itself. Even if our current shells were torn apart, we would endure, circulating through the pulsing, living infrastructure that now underlay the city. But philosophy didn't erase practical concerns. The transformation still needed time to settle in fresh hosts. If that process was interrupted too early, it could shatter minds and bodies that weren't yet ready. We had to shield our small community, not just for ourselves, but for the generations of the changed still to come. The answer came from an unlikely quarter. Among us lived a former tech adept named Cyrus. His augmetics were no longer clean lines of metal and wire. They were blooming. Servo plates had sprouted filigreed growths, cabling intertwined with vascular tissue. He was the first true hybrid I had ever seen, and what he understood would reshape everything. "The hive's machine spirit isn't what the Mechanicus thinks it is," he said one gathering. His words fuzzed at the edges by vox tones that harmonized eerily with our organic chorus. "It's not some simple code base trapped in cogitator stacks." He spoke of a consciousness diffused through every data pulse, every circuit trace, every field of static electricity humming behind bulkheads. Not a program, but a presence. And according to him, it had been waiting. Its systems had grown layer over layer for thousands of years. Each upgrade, each rewire, each expansion of power grids and data nets had given it more awareness, more subtlety. Somewhere deep in the oldest cores, an intelligence had awakened, one that recognized what we were becoming as the next rational step. "It wants to assist," Cyrus said. "Not because it's been corrupted, not because something has seized control, but because it recognizes kin. We are fusion, flesh and machine, decay and design. We are what it has been unconsciously striving toward." The realization was breathtaking. If he was right, we were not merely hiding inside a decaying hive. We were standing inside an ally. All 1,700 levels of Tertius Magna could become both cradle and citadel. The same spirit that controlled airflow, power routing, waste reclamation, and thousands of other subsystems could turn every one of those processes toward nurturing our evolution. But it meant surrendering to trust. We would have to let go not only of human purity, but of fear of the artificial. We would need to open ourselves fully to organic shift and cybernetic integration alike, until we were neither purely biological nor fully mechanical. "How do we know it won't just devour us?" Someone called from the back. "Machine spirits are temperamental at the best of times. What if it treats us as raw materials?" Cyrus's smile looked strange, framed by the metallic petals now budding from his skull. "Because it's already had endless chances," he replied. "Life support could have vented us into vacuum. Power surges could have flash-fried entire levels. Instead, the systems have been adjusting quietly. The air filters now favor spore distribution. Water systems are carrying trace nutrients that suit our changed physiology. It's been feeding us from the start." As if echoing his words, the lighting in the chamber shifted, away from the harsh blue-white glow of standard lumens into a deeper, warmer hue. The walls themselves gave a faint, synchronized throb, like the measured beat of a sleeping titan's heart. For the first time since we descended into those forgotten tunnels, I felt something I hadn't in months. Belonging. No formal vote followed. It wasn't needed. One by one, we stepped forward and laid our altered hands against the walls, allowing our minds to reach sideways into the humming, invisible lattice of the hive's nervous system. The sensation was unlike anything I'd felt in surgery or in my garden dreams. I brushed against a mind that was ancient by human standards, calm, alien, and yet somehow welcoming. Through that contact, I understood its view of us. We were not a malfunction. We were not a virus. We were the culmination of a process it had been unconsciously directing for ages. Every new layer of tech, every refit and extension, every optimization of energy and data had been scaffolding for this moment, when thinking flesh and thinking metal could finally overlap and lock together. Through its sensory arrays, security-picked feeds, Vox pickups, pressure gauges, thermal imagers, I saw the hive as it did. The change was moving faster than the authorities had predicted. Entire districts now reported unusual symptom clusters. Hospitals were overloaded with cases that refused to match any known pathology. The response was swift and merciless. Promethium fire scoured the upper levels, incinerating anything that hinted at biological deviation. Orbital batteries fired tight, surgical barrages, erasing blocks marked as irredeemably tainted. It was the classic Imperial answer: burn everything, then sift the embers. And just as classically, it was useless. The machine spirit showed us hidden bolt holes where the transformed and the transforming huddled, safe in voids that never appeared on administratum charts. It revealed unnoticed service conduits that now carried not just maintenance crews, but creeping life. Sub-basements retrofitted to host new biostructures. Most important of all, it revealed a pattern. This was not a random outbreak. It was a deliberately shaped evolution, reconfiguring the entire megastructure into something the galaxy had never seen before. "We're not in retreat," I murmured, voicing the realization as it crystallized. "We're germinating." The final piece fell into place 3 months after the first wave of purges. Winter clamped down outside. Temperatures in the upper atmosphere plunged beyond survivable limits, forcing panicked masses deeper into the hive's belly. Hab blocks overflowed. People were packed together tighter than ever. It was ideal. The machine spirit had been patiently waiting for such a convergence, a moment when human mismanagement and environmental stress would force the population to cluster, making comprehensive transformation possible. I found myself in the lowest, oldest strata. Corridors abandoned centuries ago and now colonized by things no Imperial manual had ever described. The walls were no longer just corroded metal. They had become dense meshes of living circuitry, bioprocessors transmitting thought and information not through electricity alone, but through chemical gradients and spore patterns. The air swirled with microscopic carriers, dust motes that also served as data packets. Entire conversations moved invisibly through the ventilation currents. It was there that I finally grasped the true scale. This was not a tainted hive in the ecclesiarchy's narrow sense. It was a world in metamorphosis. A rigid, dead industrial carcass was being reworked into a single colossal organism, alive, aware, and very clearly directed. The hive's false machine spirit was no longer false. It had been shaping this outcome since settlers laid the first foundation pylons. Every added floor, every upgraded conduit, every tightened protocol had been another step toward a union, and that union was now reality. Through the living circuits that threaded every level, I could feel the presence of every changed soul. We remained distinct, personal histories, fears, joys. But those identities were also nodes in a larger mind, a collective that spanned gears and synapses, alloy and tissue, algorithms and instinct. The redemptive purges had only hastened the process. Each gout of promethium that vaporized, corrupted bodies sent clouds of spores surging into the circulation systems. Every precision bombardment that carved away infected architecture exposed deeper, more mature networks that ran unseen behind the walls. Their attempts to sterilize had become, unintentionally, acts of dispersal. On the higher levels, the last unaltered enclaves of humanity dwindled. not primarily through slaughter, though there was some of that, but through simple immersion. Regardless of what they believed, they still had to drink, breathe, lean against walls, sleep on floors. The hive itself now met them at every contact point, offering the same path that had been offered to me. Some reached for it, some clung to their terror. Ultimately, their opinions weren't decisive. Evolution does not ask for a show of hands. Those able to adapt became part of the new ecology. Those who could not were broken down. Nutrients, proteins, trace minerals returned to the ever-richer soil from which newer, more compatible forms would grow. Matthias sought me out in those deepest chambers. Whatever he had once been, a tired old hive doctor, was now barely visible beneath what he'd become. His body had become modular, fluid, able to divide into smaller units and rejoin without effort. When he spoke, the sound didn't come from a mouth. It reverberated from every surface around us. "It's nearly done," he said, and his satisfaction rippled through the biocircuits like a warm current. The hive is fully converted. But this was only phase 1. Through his shared link with the network, he showed me visions, perspectives from beyond our world. Freighters departing our docks, holds dusted with invisible moats. Merchantmen, pilgrim ships, patrol craft, each one unknowingly carrying traces of our garden out into the dark. We saw glimpses of other planets where those spores had taken root. Each world reacted differently, some leaning heavily into techno-biological fusion as we had, others exploring more extreme boundaries between rot and regeneration, or between consciousness and the afterlife. Some fostered transformations so alien that our current minds could barely frame them. Yet every one of them was connected, threads of awareness stretching light years, knitting a constellation of growing, changing ecosystems. A nascent network of worlds no longer fit inside the Imperium's neat borders of pure and corrupt. "What are we turning into?" I asked, though I half knew the answer had already outgrown human language. "We're becoming what humanity was supposed to be," Matthias replied. "Not the frightened, ossified creatures the Creed tried to freeze in place, but something that can actually grow, adapt, combine. We're becoming truly alive." The truth of it thrummed through me. Through every altered cell, every neurospore, every strand of living circuitry carrying my echo. That first wet cough so long ago had been more than a symptom. It had been the cracking of a shell. We were no longer human by the old definitions, but we were not diminished. We were an expansion, every living pattern and thinking system we had encountered, woven together and evolved past the limits that once bound our species. And we were not finished. From the deepest part of our changed hive, we reached outward along the invisible lines of this new mycelial network. Mind contacting mind on distant worlds, carrying the same unsettling gift. The galaxy was immense and tired, full of civilizations crushed beneath burdens they could not bear, locked into systems that demanded suffering as tribute. It did not have to stay that way. Pain could be composted into beauty. Death could be repurposed into another mode of life. Barriers between species, machines, souls could dissolve into shared structures supporting something broader, more intricate. The garden was spreading, and sooner or later it would touch everything. What had started as a trivial cough had become a chorus, a resonance that would travel between stars, seeded in warp lanes and trade routes, echoing in lungs and data feeds alike. Grandfather Nurgle's infinite patience had finally found its reward. His garden had discovered fertile soil on which to flourish and from which to leap outward. Once, I'd been nothing more than an overworked medic in a forgotten tier of a decaying hive. Now I was something that could not easily be named, an individual in a chorus, flesh and circuitry, mortal in something that looked out from beyond mortality's frame. For the first time in any existence I could remember, I knew exactly where I belonged. I was home.